Hello! Today I'm going to read you Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It was in the middle of winter, and large flakes of snow were falling all around the royal castle. A lovely young queen sat spinning yarn at a window, the frame of which had been painted the darkest black. And as she was looking out upon the snow, she pricked her finger on the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell upon the floor. She winced for a moment, and then gazed thoughtfully through the window and said, "How I would love a little daughter with skin as white as that snow, and lips as red as that blood on the floor, and hair as black as that window frame." Less than a year later, the Queen gave birth to a daughter, and, indeed, the little girl grew up with skin as white as snow, her lips as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. The King and Queen named her Snow White, and they loved and cherished the young girl. But the lovely Queen died, and eventually the King married another wife and she became Queen. This new queen had a beautiful face, but she was so vain and proud that she could not bear to think that anyone could surpass her. She had a magical mirror in which she used to gaze at herself and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror always told the truth, and it would reply, "You, O Queen, are the fairest of them all." This satisfied the Queen greatly. Time passed, and Snow White grew more lovely and more beautiful every day. And when she was 17 years old, she was as bright as the day and fairer than the Queen herself. One day when the Queen asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" the mirror answered truthfully, "You, O Queen, are beautiful, it's true, but Snow White is far lovelier than you." When the Queen heard this, she turned pale with rage and envy. She called to one of her servants and said, "Take Snow White away into the wide wood, so that I may never see her again." Dutifully, the servant led Snow White away into the forest to carry out the Queen's orders. But his heart melted when she begged him to spare her, and he said, "I cannot hurt you, pretty child, but you must run and save yourself. You must never return to the castle." So he left her by herself there in the wood. And though he thought it was most likely that wolves would tear her into pieces, he felt as if a great weight was taken off his heart when he had made up his mind not to kill her, but to leave her to her own fate. Then poor Snow White wandered along through the wood in great fear, and the wolves howled round her, but none did her any harm. In the evening, she came to a little cottage with smoke pouring from the chimney, and went in there to rest herself, for her little feet would carry her no further. Everything was spruce and neat in the cottage. On the table was spread a perfectly clean white cloth, and there were 7 little plates with 7 little loaves, and 7 little glasses with wine in them, and knives and forks laid out in order, and by the wall stood 7 little beds. Then, as she was very hungry, she picked a little piece of each loaf, and drank a very little wine out of each glass, and after that she thought she would lie down and rest. So she tried all the little beds, and one was too long, and another was too short, but the 7th suited her quite nicely, and there she laid herself down and went to sleep. Presently in came the masters of the cottage, who were 7 little dwarfs that lived among the mountains and dug and searched the area for gold. They lighted up their 7 lamps and saw directly that all was not right. The first said, "Who has been sitting on my stool?" The second, "Who has been eating off my plate?" The third, "Who has been picking my bread?" The fourth, "Who has been meddling with my spoon?" The fifth, "Who has been handling my fork?" The sixth, "Who has been handling my knife?" The seventh, "Who has been drinking my wine?" Then the first looked around and said, "Who has been lying on my bed?" And the rest came running to him, and everyone cried out somebody had been upon his bed. But the 7th saw Snow White still in his bed, and called all his brethren to come and see her. And they cried out with wonder and astonishment, and brought their lamps to look at her, and said, "Good heavens, what a lovely child she is!" And they were delighted to see her, and took care not to wake her. And the 7th dwarf, with no bed of his own to sleep in, slept an hour with each of the other dwarfs in turn, till the night was gone, so as not to disturb Snow White. In the morning Snow White told them all her story, and they pitied her, and said that if she would keep the cottage in order, and cook and wash, and knit and spin for them, she could stay with them, and they would take good care of her. Then they went out all day to their work, seeking gold and silver in the mountains, whilst Snow White remained at home. Before they had left, the dwarfs had warned Snow White, saying, "The Queen will soon find out where you are, so take care and let no one in." The Queen, now that she thought Snow White was dead, believed that she was certainly the most beautiful lady in the land, and she went to her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror answered, "You, Queen, are the fairest in this land." But over the hills in the greenwood shade, where 7 dwarfs their dwelling have made, there Snow White is hiding from view, and she is lovelier by far than you. The Queen was enraged, for she knew that the mirror always spoke the truth, and she was sure that the servant had betrayed her, and she could not bear to think that anyone lived who was more beautiful than she was. So she disguised herself as an old peddler, and went on her way over the hills to the place where the dwarfs lived. When she arrived, she knocked at the door and cried, "I have fine wares to sell." Snow White looked out of the window and said, "Good day, good woman, what have you to sell?" "Good wares, fine wares," said she. "Laces and bobbins of all colours." "I will let the old lady in. She seems to be a very good person," thought Snow White. So she ran down and unbolted the door. "Bless me," said the old woman, "how badly your stays are laced. Let me lace them up with one of my nice new laces." Snow White did not dream of any mischief, so she stood up before the old woman and allowed her to lace her up. But the old woman set to work so nimbly and pulled the lace so tight that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if she were dead. "There's an end to all your beauty," said the spiteful Queen, and went on her way home. In the evening, the 7 dwarfs returned, and it need not be said how grieved they were to see their faithful Snow White stretched upon the ground, motionless as if she were dead. However, they lifted her up, and when they had found what was the matter, they cut the lace, and in a little time she began to breathe, and soon came to life again. Then they said, "The old woman was the queen herself. Take care next time and let no one in when we're away." When the queen got home, she went straight to her mirror and spoke to it as usual. But to her great surprise, it still said, "You, queen, are the fairest in all this land." But over the hills in the greenwood shade, where the 7 dwarfs their dwelling have made, there Snow White is hiding from view, and she is lovelier by far than you. The blood ran cold in her heart with spite and malice to see that Snow White was still alive. And she dressed herself up again in a disguise, but very different from the one she wore before. She took with her a poisoned comb. When she reached the dwarf's cottage, she knocked at the door and cried, "Fine wares to sell!" But Snow White said, "I dare not let anyone in." Then the queen said, "Only look at my beautiful combs," and gave her a poisoned one. And it looked so pretty that Snow White took it and put it in her hair to try it. But the moment it touched her head, the poison was so powerful that she fell down senseless. "There you may lie," said the queen, and went away once more. But by good luck, the dwarfs returned very early that evening, and when they saw Snow White lying on the ground, they wondered what had happened, and soon found the poisoned comb. And when they took it away, Snow White recovered and told them all that had passed, and they warned her once more not to open the door to anyone. Meantime, the queen went home to her glass and trembled with rage when she received exactly the same answer as before from her mirror. And she said, "Snow White shall die if it costs me my life." So she went secretly into a chamber and prepared a poisoned apple. The skin looked very rosy and tempting, but whoever tasted it was sure to die. Then she dressed herself up as a peasant's wife and travelled over the hills to the dwarf's cottage and knocked at the door once more. But Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I dare not let anyone in, for the dwarfs have told me not to." "Do as you please," said the old woman, "but at any rate take this pretty apple. I will make you a present of it." "No," said Snow White, "I dare not take it." "You silly girl," answered the woman, "what are you afraid of? Do you think it is poisoned? Come, you eat one part, and I will eat the other." Now, the apple was so prepared that one side was good, though the other side was poisoned. Snow White was very tempted to taste it, for the apple looked exceedingly delicious. And when she saw the old woman eat, she could refrain no longer. But she had scarcely put the piece into her mouth when she fell down dead upon the ground. "This time nothing will save you," said the queen, and she hurried home to her mirror. And at last it said, "You, queen, are the fairest of them all." And then her envious heart was glad, and as happy as such a heart could be. When evening came and the dwarfs returned home, they found Snow White lying on the ground. No breath passed her lips, and they were afraid that she was dead. They lifted her up and combed her hair and washed her face, but it was all in vain, for the little girl remained motionless, dead. So they lay her down on a bed, and all 7 watched and bewailed her death for 3 whole days. Finally they proposed to bury her, but her cheeks were still rosy, and her face looked just as it did while she was alive. So they said, "We will never bury her in the cold ground." and they made a coffin of glass so that they could still look at her, and they wrote her name upon it in golden letters and wrote that she was a king's daughter. They placed the glass coffin on a hill near the cottage, and one of the dwarfs always sat by it and watched, guarding her. Time passed, and at last the prince came by on his horse, and he saw Snow White in her glass coffin. He felt that she was not dead, that she was sleeping, that she could be woken. He offered the dwarfs money and earnestly begged them to let him to take her away. But they said, "We will not part with her for all the gold in the world." At last, however, they pitied him and gave him the coffin. But the moment he lifted it up to carry it home with him, the piece of apple fell from between her lips, and Snow White awoke and said, "Where am I?" The prince answered, "You are safe with me." Then he told her all that had happened and said, "I love you better than all the world. Please come with me to my father's palace, and you shall be my wife." Happily Snow White agreed, and she travelled with the prince on his horse to his distant home. Soon everything was prepared for Snow White's and the prince's splendid wedding. To the feast was invited, among the rest, Snow White's old enemy the Queen, and as she was dressing herself in fine rich clothes, she looked in the mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror answered, "In this land alone you are the fairest that can be seen, but the loveliest in the whole world is the new-made Queen." When the Queen heard this, she started with rage. But her envy and curiosity were so great that she could not help setting out to see the bride. And when she arrived and saw that it was no other than Snow White, who, as she had thought, had been dead a long while, she choked with shock and envy and fell ill and died. But Snow White and the prince lived and reigned happily over that land for many, many years. The end. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you next time for another story. Bye, sweet dreams.